Hey everyone, you ready for this? It's time for another deep dive. And wow, did you send in some sources for this one?
Medieval myths, huh?
Yeah, you really went all out. Articles, listicles, even a myth-busting bingo card.
Sounds like fun.
Oh, it is. And I'm ready to bust some myths. How about you?
Let's do it. I have to say, myths about the medieval period, they're everywhere, and some of them are so deeply rooted, it's hard to know where to start.
Well, since we're talking about deep-rooted, how about we start with hygiene?
Medieval hygiene.
A classic.
Right. I mean, we've all heard the stories, seen the movies. Mud-caked streets, people who haven't bathed in a year. It's practically a cliche at this point.
Oh, it's a vivid image for sure. But the truth, as always, is a bit more complicated. Our sources actually reveal a surprising emphasis on cleanliness, even among ordinary people.
Really? Like, well, for instance, did you know that soap-making guilds existed in Naples as far back as the 6th century?
Wait, the 6th century? Seriously, that's way earlier than I would have guessed.
Right. And it challenges that whole notion that hygiene was completely disregarded, and it gets even more interesting. Many medieval cities actually had surprisingly advanced water systems.
Okay, now you're just messing with me. They had plumbing.
They did. London, for example, had this elaborate network of conduits and pipes that supplied fresh water to the city.
Okay, now I'm picturing ancient Roman-style baths. Were they that advanced?
Maybe not quite Roman baths, but I did find one fascinating tidbit in our sources. When Henry VI returned to London from France in 1432, the city celebrated by making those conduits flow with free wine.
Wait, free wine from a public fountain? Okay, that's a celebration I could get behind.
Right.
Okay, so we've got soap, we've got water systems. Tell me there's more.
Oh, there's more. Let's talk about underwear.
Underwear. Okay, now this deep dive just took an interesting turn.
Not that kind of turn. Changing linen undergarments daily was a common practice, and washing laundry was a regular expense for most households, even peasant ones.
So basically we're walking around with our fancy deodorants and antibacterial soaps, and we might actually be smellier than a medieval Londoner.
It's a fascinating thought, isn't it? And speaking of misconceptions, let's tackle another big one. The idea that everyone in the Middle Ages was short, toothless, and dead by 30.
Yeah, between the movies and those tiny suits of armor you see in museums, I have to admit, I always pictured medieval folks as being, well, a bit on the short side.
I get it, and let's not forget those teeth or lack thereof.
Exactly. So is that true, or is that another myth?
It's a bit of both. It's true that the average life expectancy in the Middle Ages was significantly lower than it is today, but our sources point out that child mortality skews those numbers. If you focus on those who survived childhood, the picture changes dramatically.
So not everyone was kicking the bucket before 30.
Not at all. It wasn't unusual for people to live well into their 60s and 70s.
Okay, that's reassuring, I guess. But what about the teeth? Was everyone walking around with a mouthful of gaps?
Ah, yes. The toothless grin of the medieval peasant. It's a striking image, but again, not the whole story.
So there's hope for their smiles.
There's always hope. While we might think of medieval diets as rough, they actually contain far fewer of the sugars and processed foods that wreck our teeth today.
That's true. Sugar is the real enemy of good teeth.
Exactly. And they did care for their teeth, believe it or not. They used things like chewed twigs, especially from the licorice plant. And get this, licorice contains compounds that actually prevent tooth decay.
Hold on. Are you telling me licorice is good for your teeth? This whole deep dive is full of surprises.
It is, of course. Serious dental problems were still a reality back then, and the lack of advanced dentistry often meant tooth loss. But it seems like medieval smiles weren't quite the horror show we often imagine.
Okay, I'm definitely rethinking everything I thought I knew about the Middle Ages. We've busted the hygiene myth and the short-lived toothless myth. What else have we got?
Well, how about the idea that the medieval period was one giant, dark age of illiteracy, ignorance, and perpetual war?
Yeah, that always seemed a bit too simplistic to me. Life is never that black and white.
Exactly. So let's unpack each of these mini-myths. Firstly, constant warfare.
Okay, so is it constant?
Well, there were major conflicts. The War of the Roses comes to mind, but these events didn't consume the daily lives of most people.
So it wasn't all knights and battles all the time. Got it. What about literacy? Was it really restricted to just a select few?
That's where it gets really interesting. We have some incredible sources like these birch bark writings unearthed in Russia. These everyday documents date back to the 11th to 15th centuries and reveal a surprising level of what's called pragmatic literacy among everyday people.
Pragmatic literacy. That sounds fancy. What does it mean exactly?
It means that while they may not have been writing novels or complex treatises, ordinary people could read and write well enough to conduct business, send letters, even to teach their children the alphabet.
Okay, that's seriously impressive. I'm picturing kids doing their homework on birch bark.
And this wasn't just happening in Russia. Similar writings have been found in other parts of Europe. These discoveries totally challenge the idea that literacy was only for the wealthy or the clergy. It was far more widespread than we might think.
This is incredible. So maybe the Dark Ages weren't so dark after all.
You're getting it. The term Dark Ages itself is quite misleading. In reality, the medieval period witnessed not one, but 3 periods of intellectual and cultural flourishing, periods we now call renaissances.
3 Renaissances.
But that's a whole other deep dive for another time.
Okay, 3 Renaissances, noted.
Yeah.
We're definitely going to have to do that another time. But for now, we've got more myths to bust, right?
Absolutely. I'm sensing we're both ready for some rapid-fire myth-busting.
Bring it on. I've got our medieval myths bingo card right here. First up, Vikings with horns on their helmets. Truth or tale?
A myth, thankfully, and a relatively recent invention.
Okay, good to know. How about these? Did people in the Middle Ages believe the Earth was flat? Was medieval food bland and boring? And was travel completely unheard of?
Myths, all myths.
Okay, so tell me more, starting with that flat Earth.
Right, so the ancient Greeks, they already knew the Earth was a sphere.
Yeah, they were way ahead of their time in so many ways.
Right, and that knowledge never disappeared. It was passed down through scholars and was well known during the medieval period.
So, much for Columbus sailing off the edge of the world.
Exactly. And then there's the myth of bland medieval food. Now, it's true, they didn't have things like tomatoes or chili peppers, which came later from the Americas, but medieval cooks, they were masters of flavor. They used herbs, locally sourced spices, and some really creative combinations to make their food delicious.
That's a relief.
Yeah.
I was starting to picture a very beige and flavorless culinary experience.
Yeah, you don't want to do that. Okay, what about travel? Were they stuck in their villages or what?
Yeah, you're telling me people didn't just stay put their whole lives?
Not at all. I mean, it wasn't as easy as hopping on a plane, but travel was much more common than many people realize. People went on pilgrimages, sometimes traveling for hundreds of miles, and it wasn't just for the wealthy. We see records of merchants traveling to trade goods, scholars hitting the road for knowledge. It was a world with more movement than we think.
This is blowing my mind. I have to ask about another classic medieval image. Chamber pots being tossed out of windows. Was that really a thing?
Ah, the infamous window-tossing chamber pot. It certainly happened occasionally. Even Shakespeare mentions it in his plays.
Well, there you go. Shakespeare wouldn't lie.
Right, but our sources suggest that most medieval towns had some level of sanitation laws, including fines for littering and rules for waste disposal.
So no, just chucking your trash into the street then.
Not if you wanted to avoid a hefty fine.
Hmm.
What's fascinating is that their approach to hygiene, it wasn't just about cleanliness itself, but about this idea that bad smells, they were linked to illness. So keeping things tidy was a way of staying healthy.
Right, like don't breathe that, you'll get sick. I get it. Okay, another image I have from the movies. Animals just roaming freely through medieval towns. Were there really pigs and chickens running wild everywhere?
Well, animals were a common sight in towns and cities, that's for sure. Most people lived in close proximity to their livestock. But our sources reveal that there were often regulations against letting animals just roam free, especially in the bigger towns.
So not quite the chaotic animal farm some people imagine.
Right. Livestock, these were valuable assets, and their owners went to great lengths to keep them under control. Okay, are you ready for another myth? We've talked about hygiene, life expectancy, literacy, but there's one we haven't touched on yet, a big one.
Hit me with it.
The idea that women in the Middle Ages were powerless, no rights, no opportunities beyond their roles in the home.
Oh, wow, yeah. That is everywhere in movies and books set in the Middle Ages.
It's a powerful stereotype, but our sources, particularly legal and economic records, they tell a different story. It turns out that for many women, especially those not born into the nobility, the Middle Ages actually offered more rights and opportunities than the centuries that followed.
Wait, seriously, now that is unexpected. Tell me more.
Okay, so for example, women could own property, they could run businesses, and we even have records of them working in a wide range of trades and professions.
So not just damsels in distress then?
Not at all. They were active participants in their communities and the economy. Of course, it's important to remember that women's experiences varied greatly depending on things like social status and where they lived, but it's just not accurate to say that all medieval women were powerless.
It's like there was a disconnect between what was happening day to day and how the wealthy and powerful wanted things to be, you know?
You've hit on a crucial point. When we dig deeper into those historical records, these discrepancies pop up all the time. Take the myth of the death penalty being commonplace.
Oh, yeah. You always hear about people being hanged for stealing a loaf of bread or something like that.
Right, it's a grim image.
Hmm.
But executions, while they certainly occurred, they were far from common. Imprisoning or executing someone, that cost the community time and resources, so.
It was actually more practical to find other forms of punishment.
Exactly. Fines, pilgrimages, even public shaming, these were often considered more efficient ways of dealing with crime.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, we've busted the myth of constant executions. What else is on our list?
Let's talk knights. Specifically, the image of them being so weighed down by their armor that they could barely move, let alone fight effectively.
Oh, I've always wondered about that. You see it in movies all the time. Knights having to be hoisted onto their horses with cranes and things.
A rather undignified image for such formidable warriors, right? But in reality, a full suit of plate armor, while substantial, generally weighed about the same as the equipment a modern soldier carries.
You're kidding. So they weren't just clunking around the battlefield.
Not at all. Medieval armor was carefully designed to allow for a surprising range of motion. It was balanced with articulated joints, and knights trained extensively to use it effectively.
They were more agile than we give them credit for.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I've got one last myth on our bingo card. It's a good one. The two-finger salute. Is it true that it originated with those defiant English archers at the Battle of Agincourt?
It's a great story, isn't it? It plays into our love of rebellion and defying the odds, but sadly, our sources suggest that the Agincourt connection is a much later invention.
Oh, no. I really thought that one was true.
It's understandable why it persists, but while the two-finger gesture itself certainly existed and was probably considered rude,
I'm sure it was.
there is no historical documentation linking it to that specific battle.
Well, there you have it. Another myth bites the dust. We've covered so much ground today. Medieval hygiene, life expectancy, literacy. We even talked about underwear.
It's amazing how many misconceptions we have about the medieval period.
And it's been so eye-opening to see just how much more complex and interesting it really was.
It really is. And, by challenging these myths, I think we gain a deeper appreciation for the ingenuity, the resilience, and yes, even the sophistication of our medieval ancestors. They were living in a different world, facing different challenges, but they were just as human as we are.
It was incredible, right? I feel like I've been walking around with these cartoonish images in my head, and now I'm seeing the real people behind the myths.
That's the power of digging deeper into history. It allows us to challenge our assumptions, consider new perspectives, and ultimately gain a richer, more nuanced understanding of the past. And that understanding, believe it or not, it can actually help us navigate the present.
Okay, I love that idea. So what does this all mean for us, for our listeners? Why should we care about busting these medieval myths?
Well, think of it this way. When we engage with history in a critical way, when we're willing to question what we think we know, we equip ourselves with a really powerful set of skills. We become better at identifying biases, at recognizing how narratives are shaped, how to separate fact from fiction, and those skills, my friend, those are invaluable in today's world.
That's so true. It's like we're training our brains to be more discerning, more critical, more open to different perspectives. And honestly, that's something we could all benefit from.
Precisely. So the next time you encounter a historical myth, any myth, don't just accept it at face value. Dig a little deeper, ask some questions, and you might be surprised by what you discover.
This has been an incredible deep dive. Thank you so much for taking us on this journey and for honestly, opening our eyes to a whole new perspective on the medieval period.
The pleasure was all mine. And remember, history is full of surprises, and there are always more myths waiting to be debunked.
That's right. If you have a historical mystery you'd like us to explore, or some sources you're just dying to deep dive into, send them our way. You can find all the information in the show notes. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep on deep diving.
It really is. And by challenging these myths, I think we gain a deeper appreciation for the ingenuity, the resilience, and yes, even the sophistication of our medieval ancestors. They were living in a different world, facing different challenges, but they were just as human as we are.
It's incredible, right?
Yeah.
I feel like I've been walking around with these cartoonish images in my head, and now I'm seeing the real people behind the myths.
That's the power of digging deeper into history. It allows us to challenge our assumptions, consider new perspectives, and ultimately gain a richer, more nuanced understanding of the past. And that understanding, believe it or not, it can actually help us navigate the present.
Okay, I love that idea. So what does this all mean for us, for our listeners? Why should we care about busting these medieval myths?
Well, think of it this way. When we engage with history in a critical way, when we're willing to question what we think we know, we equip ourselves with a really powerful set of skills. We become better at identifying biases, at recognizing how narratives are shaped, how to separate fact from fiction, and those skills, my friend, those are invaluable in today's world.
That's so true. It's like we're training our brains to be more discerning, more critical, more open to different perspectives, and honestly, that's something we could all benefit from.
Precisely. So the next time you encounter a historical myth, any myth, don't just accept it at face value. Dig a little deeper, ask some questions, and you might be surprised by what you discover.
This has been an incredible deep dive. Thank you so much for taking us on this journey and for honestly, opening our eyes to a whole new perspective on the medieval period.
The pleasure was all mine. And remember, history is full of surprises, and there are always more myths waiting to be debunked.
That's right. If you have a historical mystery you'd like us to explore or some sources you're just dying to deep dive into, send them our way. You can find all the information in the show notes. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep on deep diving.